Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm Christy Coe, and this is the Stanford Digital Economy Lab Lunch Seminar. Today's speakers are Bharat Chandar and Ruyu Chen of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. Bharat is a postdoctoral researcher at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab and Institute for Human-Centered AI. He received his PhD in economics from Stanford GSB, and his focus is on labor economics and technology. And Ruyu Chen is a research scientist at the Digital Economy Lab and the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. Her research lies at the intersection of economics of innovation, information systems, and business strategy. We welcome and encourage questions during the seminar. If you are in the Zoom audience, please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. For those of you who are here in person, please do raise your hand and call out your question. We'll either run a mic to you or I will repeat the question so that the Zoom audience can also hear what you had asked. So Bharat and Ruyu, welcome. We'll start with you, Bharat. And please tell us 6 facts about the recent employment effects of artificial intelligence.
Thank you all so much for coming. We're very excited to present our work. This is a paper that Ruyu and I wrote together with Eric Brynjolfsson, who's the lab director. And we're going to be presenting Canaries in the Coal Mine, 6 facts about the recent employment effects of artificial intelligence. There's been a lot of discussion about how AI might be impacting the labor market. Pretty much every day you see a new news article about this. And a lot of the focus has actually been on entry-level workers. There's been a lot of concern that potentially the entry-level job market has been disrupted by AI. And in this paper, we're going to try to dig into that question. We're going to ask, are we already seeing changes in the labor market driven by AI? And in particular, we're going to focus on the entry-level job market given the interest around this. And the main innovation that we're going to bring to this question is we're going to have this amazing data from ADP, which is the largest payroll software provider in the United States. And via this partnership with ADP, we're going to have monthly payroll records for millions of workers every month through July 2025. And we're hoping to keep this updated going forward. So we want to build a dashboard where you can kind of track these changes over time. Here's a quick preview of our results. And Ruyu is going to get into this in a lot more detail once he takes over. But to start, we find a decline in employment for 22 to 25-year-olds in AI-exposed jobs. And what's striking about this is that we find a 13% relative decline in employment even after we condition on firm time shocks that we might expect to be impacting employment overall at the firm. So these are relative changes, and even then we're seeing these major employment declines. We do not see these same employment declines for people who are not exposed to AI, and for more senior workers, even in jobs that are more exposed to AI. So this is something that we're really seeing for these entry-level workers in these more exposed jobs. Third, we see these declines in the type of jobs where AI use is more automative, but not so much in the types of jobs where AI use is more augmentative. And we'll dig into that a little bit more as well. We find limited impacts on annual salary, which is kind of interesting. We'll show those results later. And we also show robustness across a variety of alternative analyses. So, we considered a range of possibilities that might explain our results that are not driven by AI. And we'll talk through some of the robustness checks and the alternatives that we consider. Among those is removing the tech sector, removing computer occupations. We get very similar results there. We removed teleworkable jobs. We might be worried that return to work post-COVID might be driving some of these changes. We don't find that seems to explain our results. And we have a lot more that we'll discuss as well. But we're also very open to suggestions. So if you all have ideas on other analyses that we should try out, we would love to test them out in the data as well. So I'll say a little bit about prior work in this space. There's been a variety of papers that have tried to study these questions using government data sets, including some work of my own. And overall, I'll show this on the next slide, but we haven't seen widespread evidence of employment declines overall across the entire economy. Now, a limitation of these sorts of analyses is that when you're looking at data like the current population survey, the sample size are just not very large. And if you want to dig into, say, entry-level workers in these more exposed jobs, the data just get very noisy. So it's difficult to say very much about these specific groups that we might be worried about using the government data. There's also other work that studies this, for example, Hammam and Vestergaard, Hempel et al. 2025, et cetera. But they can't really dig into these time series for age-occupation pairs that we're going to dig into in this paper in very recent periods. And then since our paper came out, there are also several other papers that have found very similar results. Doche and Bantok is actually from a VC firm called Signalfire. Their paper actually came out before ours, their report, and they actually found very similar results in the tech sector. And then Hosseini and Lichtinger, who presented last week at this seminar, they showed very similar results as well. And now there's a paper from the UK by Klein Tieselink, who finds very similar results as well. OK, but let's get into that a little bit further. So this is from a paper that I wrote in June, looking at job displacement in more versus less exposed jobs using government data from the current population survey. And we didn't see a divergence here between more versus less exposed jobs. Now, a limitation of this is that we can't really dig into younger versus older workers. We can't dig into the entry-level labor market versus a more senior labor market. The data are already pretty noisy, and if you want to dig into the data that finely, you end up with very small cells, and it becomes difficult to kind of dig into this. And that's a shame, because a lot of the discussion around this has really been focusing on the entry-level labor market. There's so many articles that have been coming out kind of warning that the entry-level labor market has been disrupted by AI. Here's just one example from the Wall Street Journal. You've also heard it from tech CEOs. Dario Amodei was saying that, from Anthropic, was saying AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years. So it's really a shame that we didn't have data to try to dig into this question and see how the labor market is actually being impacted. And that's really where we wanted to come in with our paper. So how do we study this? We have this data from ADP. This is payroll records, like I mentioned, from the largest payroll software provider in the United States. And here in our main sample, we're going to focus on full-time workers who are regular. Regular means non-temporary workers. So we're excluding internships, et cetera. We'll show robustness to that as well. And we're going to look at workers aged 22 to 70. And we're going to compare younger versus older workers and how their employment is changing in these more AI-exposed jobs. We construct a balanced sample of firms for our main analysis that goes from 2021 to 2025. Basically, this means that we're going to look at firms that are observed in ADP over that entire period. And so that's just going to make it so that our results, we don't have to be worried that it's driven by changes in who's joining versus leaving ADP over time. And we can also show results that show what happens when we relax that restriction. We're going to join that data with AI exposure measures. And we focus on 2 primary AI exposure measures. The first one is from Alandu et al. So this is the GPTs paper that came out in 2024 in Science. It's written by Daniel Rock at Wharton and then some researchers at OpenAI who kind of classify different jobs into whether they're more or less exposed to AI. And we're also going to use data on actual AI usage. This is coming from the Anthropic Economic Index. So some researchers at Anthropic have collected these conversations that are going into Claude, and then they associate each of those conversations with different occupations. And we can get a measure of which occupations are seeing more LLM usage versus less LLM usage via that. And a nice thing about their data set is that they also classify these conversations into whether they're more automative versus more augmentative usages of AI. Ruyu will talk a little bit more about that as well. And so we can get a sense of how are these patterns different for occupations where AI usage is more automative versus more augmentative. OK, so let's just get into the results now. This is our first fact. We find employment declines for young exposed workers. And we'll start by just showing some case studies, and then we'll generalize to the broader economy. So first, let's look at software developers, because this has been an example that a lot of people have been interested in. What we find here is that employment for older workers who are software developers has been growing pretty robustly, even post-2022. But for young workers, we see this particular divergence around late 2022. So employment for 22 to 25-year-olds in particular has been declining since that time period. And it's pretty striking. It's a 20% decline in employment for these young software developers since late 2022. So this notion that the entry-level job market has been quite difficult in tech and in software development seems to be borne out in this data. What's striking is that we also see these patterns for customer service, which is a very different type of occupation, but is also an occupation that's quite AI exposed. Eric has a paper, a well-known paper that studies the impact on customer service productivity of rolling out these AI tools. And he finds that the less skilled workers in particular see these major improvements from using these tools. But what we find here is that for these younger workers, we're still seeing these employment declines. Whereas for more experienced workers, they're still seeing actually pretty robust growth in employment. Now, here's an example of a job that's less exposed to AI. Here we're looking at health aides. So that includes nursing aides, psychiatric aides, and home health aides. So these are jobs that have a large physical component, a lot of social interaction with patients. And here we actually see the opposite pattern, where the youngest workers are actually having faster employment growth than more experienced workers. And I'm going to hand it over to Ruyu, who's going to talk through how this generalizes across the economy and then think through some of the robustness that we consider.
Thanks, Bharat. So the examples we just showed are not just cherry-picked. Now let's look at this set of charts that generalize the finding. So each of the chart represents an age group. Within each age group, we plot the trend of headcounts for those more exposed jobs versus the less exposed jobs. Now let's focus on the top left. These are the group for the youngest workers, aged 22 to 25. We can see that the line is divergent downward for the more exposed jobs from the less exposed ones. And if we look at the other age groups, actually this divergence just disappeared. So the effect is real and more concentrated among the young workers. And this exposure score is from the Yolanda's paper using the GPT beta. And our second fact is that this adds up to the overall slowdown in hiring among the youngest workers in more exposed jobs. So this is entirely driven by the more exposed jobs. This chart makes it clear. This shows the employment growth by age beams. The blue bars are the less exposed jobs, and the orange bars are the more exposed jobs. We can see that for the youngest group, the growth is very strong, but the growth for the lowest exposed jobs are very strong. But for the high exposure jobs, it has declined by over 5%. And the growth trend for all other age groups are positive. So here we see that this effect is driven mostly by the young and more exposed workers. Of course, we have other hypotheses, so we are going to test different alternatives later. And our third fact digs into the type of AI. What will happen when AI will automate works versus where AI is augmenting work? So on the first chart, we consider jobs where AI is considered to automate tasks, like software, accounting and auditing, and information clerks. So this is from the Anthropic AI Index. Let's look at the first graph. The top left chart shows the early career workers. We see this familiar pattern, that is the decline for the youngest workers. But when we move to the jobs where AI is considered to mostly augment human capabilities, think management, nurturing, maintenance, and repair, actually this pattern disappears. We see a slight increase even for the youngest workers in terms of employment after late 2022. And the growth trend are also consistent among other age groups. So the distinction, let's just be clear on the distinction between automation versus augmentation. So for automation behaviors, that means where AI directly executes the tasks with minimal human involvement. For example, fixing a script or some task where AI will just help you to execute it. But for augmentative behaviors, that means AI will enhance human capabilities through the human and AI collaboration. So you get feedbacks from AI, you learn from the feedbacks, and you revise your work. The examples including learning a very complex concept or having a very, or brainstorming a strategy. So this distinction tells us the impact of AI is not monolithic. Actually, it depends on whether AI serves as a substitute or augment to human labor. So one potential criticism might be that we are just picking some industry-level shocks or firm-level shocks that happens to correlated with occupational sorting in terms of age or exposure score. For example, the rising interest rate could hit the tech sector heavily, which happens to hire a lot of the young software engineers. So to address this, we conduct this event study where we add the firm time fixed effects and firm quintile fixed effects in the regression. In this way, we can just absorb the shocks that affect all workers in the company and then compare the relative changes in hiring between the more exposed roles versus the less exposed roles. So we run this regression separately for each of the 6 age groups, and the results are showing here. So the coefficient for more exposed jobs among the younger workers declined significantly. This amounts into a 13% relative decline in employment for young and exposed workers, even after controlling for the firm-wide shocks. But the lines for all the other age groups are essentially flat. So this tells us the effect is real and is more concentrated. Our fifth fact relates to pay. Given the decline in employment, we might expect, okay, there might be some dynamic changes in wages. However, we find no clear divergence in annual salary. The salary trend for more exposed roles versus the less exposed roles are almost identical across all age groups. It tells us that while it might be harder for the young worker to get a job in the most exposed sector or in most exposed occupations, those who do get hired have not experienced a negative impact compared to their peers. So, but the effect might be different in the future, so we will just keep monitoring the data. Because it's relatively easier for the firms to adjust hiring, especially to adjust headcount, especially on the hiring side. But it's very difficult for a firm to cut down the wages, right? The wages may take longer time to show in the data. For example, it will not follow up with the inflation rate. So we will look at this question again in the future. Finally, our sixth fact holds up under a variety of alternative hypotheses. For example, our co-finding still holds even if we excluding the entire tech sector or all the computer-related jobs. When we look separately at the teleworkable jobs versus the non-teleworkable jobs, it's the same for college workers versus the workers with no college education, and is similar among men and women. We also try to include the part-time and temporary workers into the data, and still we see this trend. Finally, we tested the occupational level interest rate. So there's a paper published in 2022 where the authors just calculated the response to monetary shock at the country level for each occupation group. So thanks for the author for providing us this data. We find that for occupations that are more sensitive to interest rate versus those that are less sensitive, it's essentially no significant difference. And more alternative tests are available in the paper. And we are also happy to take any advices if you have. So some comments. So why is this effect more concentrated among the young workers? One compelling theory by Josh is that AI might be a complement to senior workers because they provide the Tencent knowledge at the firm. Think about the customer relationship for lawyers or some firm-specific knowledge. But for the junior workers, AI might be a direct substitute for them because they are mostly conducted the well-defined tasks. So AI might be hit the book learning knowledge, but not on-the-job learning so far. But of course, another explanation is that these are just temporary impacts for young workers as the firms just experiment. So will the effects on young workers last? So one very good point about David Deming is that over the last century, all the different wave of general purpose technology has favored the young and well-educated workers because they can adapt to the new technology more easily. He thinks AI will not be different. So we still have lots of questions waiting for more exploration. For example, will it create new work for humans or just more work for AI? Will it hit the college graduates harder? Or will these young workers adapt very fast? Or will it impact the experienced workers too in the future? And how about the inequality? So we will be tracking this data and try to explore these questions. So our paper just provides the first large-scale real-time evidence on some of the facts we see on the labor market impacted by AI. So we call it the Canaries in the coal mine. Yeah, thank you so much, and we'd be happy to answer questions.
Thanks for the really interesting talk. I wonder if you could go back a slide or two yes, perfect. So I was curious to ask you about this because it seems like this goes the opposite direction of Eric Bernolfson's previous talk or previous paper on generative AI at work, which argued there that what you're doing is you're capturing tacit knowledge and you're providing it to junior workers. You're seeing the opposite effect here. So instead of seeing junior workers be sort of able to act as senior workers, do you think that's just because the way people are using AI is quite different here, that they're not doing training within a firm, and so they're not capturing that tacit knowledge? But I'm curious to hear your hypotheses.
Do you want to take first?
Sure, I can take this. So one thing that's interesting about that is you could imagine that it could improve young workers' ability to do various types of tasks, but there are certain tasks that they just are not as capable of doing that might require more tacit knowledge. So these are things that involve on-the-job learning, and it could be that AI might help these young workers in the types of tasks that where that's not as true, but for these other types of tasks where you really need on-the-job experience, it's just not as effective at enabling people to develop to the same level as more experienced workers. So I don't necessarily view them as in contrast with each other or in conflict with each other. there is a world in which both of these things can be true at the same time. I don't know if you have more to say there.
Yeah, and also we can take some other example other than customer representatives. Think about lawyers. The experienced lawyers have more of this, for example, the customer relationships and their experience. So these senior workers could work better with AI. But the entry-level workers, they just enter the market and they do the very well-defined tasks. So that's why the entry-level lawyers are impacted further. So this example is different from the customer representatives in terms of the hierarchy.
Thank you. I want to follow up on what you said. So I'm a software engineer. And the one thing that differentiates senior engineers from the younger ones is that you interact more with product managers, with customers. There is a more relational component, and you spend less time writing code. Some even senior engineers, they have the name only. They spend most of the time. So could that be exactly that is what you're describing for lawyers, that essentially what AI is doing is replacing the repetitive thing? And if that's the case, then the follow-up question is, to become an experienced software engineer, you need the experience. And if nobody is hiring young engineers to become experienced, because the law is different, the law is going to be here forever because it's the law. But software engineers, you need somebody to give somebody an opportunity to become experienced before they can go to the next level. So.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. We sit here in Silicon Valley. We've heard similar ideas from different companies that have been going through hiring. I think they've brought up a lot of points very similar to what you just said. And I do think this paper raises a lot of questions about exactly the sorts of questions that you're asking about. What does this imply going forward if these younger workers are not being hired and they don't get the chance to develop that experience? And something that's interesting about that is there's this kind of well-known phenomenon in labor economics. It kind of goes back to Gary Becker many decades ago. But there's something of a public goods problem with hiring young workers. The idea is if you invest in teaching people how to do the job, they could then leave and go to another firm. And so this creates a bit of an incentive misalignment where firms may not have as much incentive as would be socially optimal to invest in these younger workers. And it's possible that AI could make that problem even more acute.
Yeah, following Bharat's points, in the early diffusion stage, so the on-the-job training is very important, and sometimes the mobility across firms of these workers is just one important way for the young workers to equip with the most recent technology, and also it takes time to create some new jobs and new roles. Maybe those younger people will be more adapted to it. For example, prompt engineers. So I think it's important for us to teach the the young workers to learn the most advanced or most cutting-edge technologies. For example, the AI agent like Cursor and Devon. These are not something taught at the universities, but if they can equip themselves with these tools and know how to effectively use it, I think they will be in a better position in the labor market.
I have a question from online that is somewhat related to this, so I'm going to bring that in here. Does this capture the actual impact of Gen AI or its expected impact, in the sense that companies might be waiting to hire to observe how Gen AI could affect their workforce? And so are they sort of replacing these entry-level workers in anticipation of this?
Yeah, I think the anticipation channel is very one of the most reasonable explanation for our story, because we see a very sharp decline right after the launch of ChatGPT 3.5. In our internal discussion, we say that because some of the earlier technology already exists, like a Copilot. So this the economy-wide shock will change firms' anticipation. And also, when the adoption cost for this new technology is very low, it's not zero, but it's lower than previous general-purpose technology. So it's very likely that the firms are just waiting to see what will happen.
Yeah, and I guess to give you some data on that, AI is it's well known that it's one of the fastest adopted tools basically in history. And then I guess to get into that a little bit, so there's this index that's put out by a company called RAMP that basically tracks business spend on different issues, but they have this specific index that tracks AI spend. So our company is paying for subscriptions for different AI services. And they show basically from 2023, early 2023 onwards, it's grown very rapidly. Their number is closer to 45% now. You do get different estimates. Other estimates are closer to 20%. Others are a little lower. But it does seem like this has been a very rapidly adopted technology. Like Ruyu said, the adoption cost could be lower for this technology than previous things. For example, major disruptions like electricity or railroads, there were huge infrastructure investments that had to be made even at the firm level, whereas that may not be as true with AI.
I want to hear more about wages, right? So, I mean, you find no effect, and you seem to be eager to suggest that that's maybe just stickiness of wages, but I mean, have you done something else? It's been already, I guess, a couple of years of the beginning of the shock. Is there something you can do, exploit sectoral variation? And I would like to hear, I guess, your intuition, where your minds are heading about what could explain that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So there are a few things about that. One is I think just kind of economically, it's not obvious what the direction of the wage impact should be. So on the one hand, there's kind of an overall potential decline in demand, labor demand for these types of jobs, and that could depress wages. But on the other hand, it could be that there's a change in who is getting hired versus not getting hired. And it could be that maybe it's the cream of the crop that's getting hired, and because of that, you might have expected wages to go up. So I do think the direction of how it might impact wages is not so clear. Now that said, there's also other work that we're hoping to do. So we were just showing kind of base salary changes. It's possible that there could be impacts on things like bonuses, et cetera. So we want to dig into that a little bit more. We have some data on that via ADP as well, but we're trying to make sense of that a little bit.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to incorporate that.
Sure. And besides the ambiguous direction on wages, another potential story is that there might be heavier inequality among certain groups. For example, if we consider those young workers, in our paper, we see the decline in terms of employment. But here in Silicon Valley, we also heard that the story that Meta is paying crazy money to poaching the talents. So it's likely that the superstar workers are performing better, but in general, this group is having a downward employment. So we are also trying to dig into each group and to see what's happening in terms of wages.
I'm interested in the difference you notice between exposure of young workers to automated versus augmented jobs. And if I understood right, we basically found is the effect is pretty much only on automated tasks. Yeah. And so I wonder if you've thought about potential reasons for that. And one, I think, probably obvious hypothesis would be that young people, that Demet is correct, that young people are in fact better at adopting new technologies than old people. But if it's a matter of automation, you're not going to be adopting the technology, you're going to be replaced by it. Whereas if it is a matter of augmentation, then the workers you want are the young people who are going to be good at taking advantage of those tools. So is that, have you thought about this? Are there other hypotheses? Do you have some evidence?
Yeah, that's a really great comment, Tom. That's very helpful. Probably the paper that is most relevant to this is there's a paper by David Otter and co-authors where they're basically looking at new work that's created over time. And they're basically associating that with patents that get produced. So when there are new technologies that seem to augment a given profession, those professions see these wage increases, these employment increases, et cetera. When it seems to automate the sort of tasks in a profession, we see results that are very similar to what we find. So that paper is looking over, I think, like 80 years of data or something. And they show these patterns are more general across different types of technologies. When work is more augmentative, or sorry, when new technology is more augmentative, they tend to increase employment and wages in those professions. When it's more automative, it tends to decrease employment and wages in those professions. So I would say that that broadly seems to hold true with our results as well. So it could be this is more general phenomenon, but I do think it's really interesting point that you're raising about maybe these young workers are adopting the technology when it is more augmentative, but when it's just automative, they're not, they just can't get the work.
Related question to that one. You mentioned at the beginning that your plan is to do this longitudinally. I'm wondering if you've studied or will study how the definition and measurement of exposure or the classification of augmentative versus automative will change over time. For example, with computer vision and robotics, manual tasks that today cannot be replaced by AI might eventually be fully replaced by AI.
Yeah, so in this paper, we used two external methods. One is the Eulander's occupational level AI exposure, and the other is AI index using the cloud conversation. Actually, we also tried the third method, that is in the ADP data, we have the job level description. We have their own assigned tasks by the ADP research team. We just replicate Yolanda and Daniel's the prompts, and we conducted our own exposure score construction. And actually, the results are very similar to this one. And on your second point, I think that raises a very good forward-looking question, whether the definition for AI exposure will be changed over time, especially when the robots are going to impact the labor market. For example, if some works that cannot be done remotely now can be done with a teleoperation system. So our paper shows the impact of generative AI. I'm pretty sure in the next wave, the robotics will hit another set of occupations.
So I think it's a great point. I think we want to try additional AI exposure measures in the paper as well. And then the other thing I want to say about this is that 2 weeks ago, the Anthropic economic team, they actually released a new version of the index. And it's actually pretty interesting because in previous waves of the index, they were finding that a higher share of the conversations were augmentative than automative. But that's actually kind of flipped in more recent periods where as of, say, like a month ago or so, now there's a higher share of automative conversations than augmentative conversations. So I think you're right that these classifications may change over time, like which jobs are more exposed versus less exposed could change, and then how the usage, whether it's more automative or augmentative, can also change. So I think that's a great point, and we should think through that as well, is incorporating kind of these dynamics in the AI usage and exposure.
Chuck Easley, Management Science and Engineering. So I thought you guys did a lot on the first part of Deming's quote about the younger workers, but I wondered if there's any more analysis that you can do around the second part, around education, and whether those that have a master's degree or those that have more AI-related skills are more insulated, perhaps, from these changes, or if it's better for them to just go out and get the work experience. And then I was also wondering about the pre-period, because with the pandemic, there was a lot of stimulus. There was this whole fast forwarding of digital transformation very quickly, and so I wondered if the pre-period is more the anomaly.
Great. Okay, so two things about that. One about the education. So, Ruyu, do you want to show the results for? So regarding education. On average, more college-educated workers are much more exposed to AI than non-college workers. And that kind of makes sense. Like college workers are doing more knowledge work, et cetera. So on average, the college workers according to these measures, are much more exposed than less exposed workers. Now, within the non-college category, there's also a lot of variation in exposure. So you can imagine things like customer service. You probably don't have a college degree, but it's more exposed. Whereas if you're a mechanic or something, you also probably don't have a college degree, but you're also not very exposed. So we get very similar results if we just focus on occupations where people don't have a college degree. And then in occupations where people do tend to have a college degree, we're seeing kind of like an overall employment decline. There are not that many professions that are college educated and not very AI exposed, but we do see an increase in those occupations. So it's kind of consistent across both of those groups. Your second question, I'm sorry, I'm trying to.
Whether the pre-period was in all.
Okay, so I don't remember if we, oh yeah, here it is. Yeah, so this is over a longer time period. And you can see that, so basically we don't see, even if you go back to 2018, which is basically the start of our data, we don't notice the same kind of ordering of more versus less exposed jobs, even over that longer time horizon. This like ordering where the more exposed jobs are declining and the less exposed ones are continuing to grow. We really only see that post 2023 or so. So we do have some of those results in the paper.
Yeah, just to add one point on the less educated workers. So actually here in this graph, we are picking up some of the works that heavily rely on physical skills, like the maintenance and repair, because we are looking at the impact of generative AI. It's not the general AI. Maybe for robotics and for other AI, it will be slightly different.
There's actually another thing I want to add to this, which is if you go back to the non-college, we actually are seeing that these kind of divergences between the more and the less exposed jobs, you even see it at higher age groups for the non-college workers, which is kind of interesting. So, if we believe the story about on-the-job learning, that seems to matter probably less for these types of occupations than college-heavy occupations.
A follow-on question to the last one from the gentleman here about automation indices. Would be curious about your reflections on the robustness of things like the Anthropic Economic Index, especially thinking about it compared to OpenAI released something that's somewhat similar to it. Is there more you desire from these kinds of indices? What more data would be the most useful? How much do you rely on them? And what do you pin differences between between Anthropic and OpenAI? Is it that the models are better doing different things? Is it inconsistencies in how they classify and report data? Just any kind of practical reflections on those indices. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for this question. Yeah, these are good points. Actually, Daniel Rock has one recent notes on some comments on the recent exposure score. One of the essential takeaways is that it's very hard for us to create a very perfect score that can be used for all the occupations and for a long time, because as Bharat already mentioned, by nature is very dynamic. It's evolving and changing over time. So what we are trying to our best to create our own measures, including use the job level description, job level task from the ADP's own data. And we are trying to ask them to have some job posting data so that we can better track the changes over time. We execute the tasks from those job postings, and we apply the prompts from all the existing papers, and we create our own scores. And according to our initial attempts, the results are largely consistent with what we already find.
If I could add a couple things to that. So one thing that's kind of interesting is insofar as you think these measures might not be picking up AI usage and exposure very well, it's actually kind of interesting. If you think that these exposure measures are not very good, then you would actually not expect any employment impacts that we're showing. Basically, if you think about it, like if they were just completely random, like the exposure measures meant nothing, then you shouldn't expect to see any divergence between more and less exposed jobs. So insofar as you do, that's pretty striking, and it might actually be some form of validation for these measures, and they're actually picking up something that's useful. Now, that said, we do want to consider more AI exposure measures, like Ruyu was suggesting. And in terms of differences between the different companies, like you mentioned, OpenAI just released something about this. I don't believe that their data is public, but we need to look into that more. In contrast, the Anthropic measures are all easy for us to use. So it would be great if more companies made their data publicly accessible for us to use. But we're also going to continue to evaluate different exposure measures and see how the results hold up.
And thank you for the sharing, and also thank you for sharing this classification. I think it's a great implementation for us to how to use AI afterwards. I have a question is about, I want to ask about if the automation and argumentation is like mutually exclusive. So like I think for certain tasks is like different types, but for most of the jobs in our daily lives, it's like a mixture of automation and argumentation tasks, such as the creative directors. Some of the works can be replaced by AI, and other things like the creatives and brainstorming work might be augmented. So if we would like to see the impact of the detailed jobs, how can we see the implications of AI?
Yeah, so just a clarification about what we did with that. You're absolutely right. So within an occupation, there are some uses that are more augmentative and some uses that are more augmentative. And what we're doing is all the conversations that relate to an occupation, we're basically saying what share of them are automative and what share of them are augmentative, and then and there's another category which is neither. So the ones where the highest share is automative, those are kind of our most automative exposed occupations. The ones where the usage is most augmentative, the highest share of them are augmentative. Those are kind of our classification of the most exposed in terms of augmentation. And so just to clarify, that's the way we did it. You're absolutely right that within individual occupations, there can be both automative and augmentative usage. So we're basing it on their shares of automated versus augmentative conversations.
Yeah, and also this is the classification for tasks into occupations is not created by our own or by the cloud team. Actually, it's based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So anyone who wants to follow on this work, they can just refer to the definition of the task lists for different occupations. So it's a fixed rubric.
I want to bring in a couple more questions online. So these insights are obviously from past payroll data. Do you have any hypotheses on whether these trends will continue, i.e. would young workers maybe mature in their job to the point where AI becomes complementary, like how it currently is for senior workers today?
Yeah, I mean, Ruyu just showed the slide, but I think there are so many open questions, and we need to continue to track this going forward, which we're going to do. So we're hoping to build a dashboard that kind of updates our figures over time, and you can kind of track in real time what's happening. But I do think there's a lot of open questions. It could change over time. It could be that young workers in the long run might benefit more than older workers. It's going to be hard to do this prediction about what's going to happen in the future. We want to. There's a lot of possibilities, and we just kind of want to track what's happening here empirically.
Yeah, we are also monitoring the job posting data. That's the most real-time demand from the firm side, where we try to extract the tasks and see whether there are some new roles or even new occupations created by this wave of technology.
One more question here from online. Have you examined the impacts of COVID remote work on this? Are we seeing only the impacts of Gen AI, or could it be that we're seeing the generation struggle that we didn't socialize and mentor and educate properly a few years ago on how to be successful, et cetera?
Okay, I think there are two things in that. So first, we see the results even for non-teleworkable jobs. So these are jobs that would not have been remote worked during COVID. We still see that among those occupations, the most exposed jobs are seeing these employment declines. And I think the second thing was about education. So what's, I guess going back to the results for non-college workers, we were seeing that even for older workers where it's not as plausible that education impacts could have been driving those changes.
I I had a question on as AI is improving so quickly, as it continues to evolve and get better and better, and more things can be automated. Is that going to really like how might that change how many young people can get these jobs? And over long term, since like the generations aren't passing down information as much potentially, like in the really long term, what are we going to be in trouble just worldwide with all these very few people are people who have the experience, and then very few have young people were given the opportunity to learn, and then when they go, like, are we going to be in more of a societal trouble? Or and then the last one is there any has there been any studies on how it's affecting entrepreneurship right now? Like, is there a lot more young people moving towards that because it's becoming easier? There's more opportunity there, I feel like, compared to some of these other industries.
So on your first point, it's very relevant to the question we just answered. So I think maybe it's important for the policymakers to build some program to help the young workers learn about the most cutting-edge technologies or tools, so that they can have more competitive advantage in the labor market. And maybe there will be some new roles created for them. Maybe the young workers will be more adept to the newly created tasks. So on your second point, sorry, what's the second?
When you have a bunch of, there's no transmission of that knowledge and wisdom to the younger generation.
Yeah. So I think we are monitoring the entire economy. So in total, there are over 20 million workers in the ADP data, and here we are capturing around 5 million of them. I agree that the entrepreneurship and startup will be a very compelling explanation for what's happening here in the Silicon Valley. But when we look at the wider economy, maybe they just account for a very small fraction of the young workers and of the entire labor force. But we will have follow-on works focusing on California and the Silicon Valley, and look at the performance of workers in this area.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, whether it's getting more people into entrepreneurship. We haven't really looked at that in this paper. We want to see if we can find some data about that. I think it's a great question. And like Ruyu was saying, it doesn't seem to be driving our results. For example, we're seeing these impacts for customer service and different types of occupations that we wouldn't think the outside option is entrepreneurship necessarily. But I still think it's a great question, like, is it driving more people into entrepreneurship? That could have big implications. So if we could get data on that, I know that there are people in the lab actually who are working on studying that question. So I think it's something that we would love to keep track of.
Is there any effect of AI driving the quality of labor down prior to them entering the workforce? So for example, is there any effect of AI driving the quality of labor down before entering the workforce? So for example, like, if you come in to the workforce from college, but you never developed soft skills because you used AI in college, does this study, or is that effect captured anywhere? Like, do we know anything about that? Yeah.
Right. So, two things about that. One is we are kind of observing these changes, like I mentioned, even for these non-college workers, even at higher age ranges for those groups. So I don't think it's like necessarily just a change in, say, college education or something. So the other thing I'll say about that is, in general, most papers have tended to find that AI makes people more productive, not less productive. Now, you might be worried that maybe they're not measuring it in certain types of skill, such as social skills or something. But there are some exceptions to that, but I would say overall they've tended to find that AI tends to boost productivity and not decrease it in various dimensions. And especially for people who might be less productive or less skilled at the time that AI is getting adopted. So if anything, you might think that in those types of tasks that young workers might become more productive than they were before.
Hey, I'm David Groh. I have a question. It's maybe a little complicated. I think we exchanged messages briefly about this, but I'm kind of confused about it. And the question, I guess, is around, I guess a lot of this discussion and commentary has been about this age distinction, like on slides 22 and 23, about what's going on with the difference between the younger workers. And I'm kind of confused by this. I think when that age bracket is kind of unique in that it will always shrink. Like it will always shrink every year. You'll always lose a quarter of that age bracket because they will age up. So I guess in this, you'll see this effect anytime there's a slow where, for the past century, no matter what it is, anytime job hiring slows, the youngest bracket will always be affected most. So trying to put a lot of things about, why is AI affecting the youngest bracket? Is this really unique? So my question, I guess, is how do we disentangle that? When is a 13% decline significant that, something's weird happening to the younger age bracket? And when is that just, hiring has slowed and people are aging up and people who have jobs are just aging and that's the effect?
Yeah, so I think the key point here is that we're seeing these distinctions. So for the young workers in the less exposed jobs, we are not seeing these effects. So I think that differential is pretty key here. So it's not, it's not clear like why that aging impact would only impact these like more exposed jobs, but not the less exposed jobs.
Hi. Quick question. I was just wondering if there's any studies or do you have any indication on how AI has affected production quality, especially in more technical roles like software engineering? Because I know that when ChatGPT first came out, companies like Duolingo said they were going to be able to replace a lot of their workers with AI, and then come back on that statement and have started rehiring. So I guess, have you witnessed any of that resurgence and can talk to whether production quality has changed?
Yes, so that's not really the focus of our paper. There is a large literature that's trying to measure productivity impacts of AI adoption. My impression is that on average, they've tended to find that it boosts productivity, but there are some exceptions to that, notably the meter study, but I would say that overall they've tended to find that it's boosted productivity, but that's not really something that our paper speaks to necessarily.
So this was looking back for LLMs. What about looking forward? Agentic AI, multi-agent systems. What's your prediction? Will junior people again be replaced? I'm watching a lot of agentic AI videos, and it seems pretty CS heavy, a lot of new terms. So what's your prediction about that?
Yeah, for agentic AI, we don't know the future, but one prediction is that both the junior workers and also the senior workers are good at it. So but they may have different impact. So for the junior workers, maybe they just have more span of control over the firm, so they can perform more tasks, have higher productivity, and they manage more people. So the organizational structures will be changed. And for the younger people, because they may be adapting more quickly, they can be have higher demand in the labor market. And besides agentic AI, there is also robotics, so they will impact a different sector of the labor market. I think it would be a very interesting question, and we will be monitoring and find other potential data source to untangle these questions.
So based on your hypothesis, I was just wondering if you've noticed any data of younger people entering the workforce pivoting their fields to like more non-exposed fields. And to that point, would that be like, would you recommend that for younger workers entering the workforce?
So I think there's some very tentative evidence on this that I've seen that people might be switching their college majors towards majors that might be less exposed to AI. So there might be some tentative evidence of that yet, but I actually think that's a great area for more research. We would love to study that question too.
Yeah,
like, are people responding to these impacts and changing their occupational choices or their education choices accordingly? So I think it's a great question.
Another trend is that maybe the coding skill is diffusion more widely across different occupations than before. There's a recent paper by Sonny Tumby from UPenn, and that paper suggests that the algorithmic scale is more important for across all occupations. Like for managers, they need to do how to do the coding thing, and for marketing people or for like more roles within the company. So it's also very likely that the CS major people, they can find a variety of jobs, not only for developers, but they can be the manager, they can be the marketing, sales, etc.
That is all we have time for. Can we just give our speakers a round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and thank you everyone online for joining us too. We could not get to all of the questions, so please check out our website for news on our other events, and please sign up for our newsletter. Thanks.